Asher, welcome to Career Shorts. Can we start off by you telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
My name's Asher Mullard. I'm a science journalist who covers the biopharmaceutical industry. So I write about everything from basic science to target identification to clinical trials, regulatory affairs, industry trends. I am a freelance journalist. I mainly write for Nature Reviews Drug Discovery, but I write for other clients as well, including Nature. I've written for New Scientist, Lancet, many others.
Cool. And how did you become a science journalist?
So I always thought I was going to do a PhD in biochemistry. I studied biochemistry in undergrad, and I worked in various labs over the years trying to figure out where I wanted to focus my PhD, and came to the realization that I was more of a generalist, and was working in London in a lab in London at the time, and saw a job opening at Nature Reviews Molecular Cell Biology as a copy editor. And I applied for that job always with the intent of trying to explore writing. I'd been interested in writing even through my undergrad. I took my non-science courses were typically history and English, where I was writing a lot. I always had that interest. So when I went to Nature, I wanted to get into writing. I made that fairly clear from the beginning that as a copy editor, I wanted to write, and took every opportunity I could get to write. And I've now been writing about science for 10, 15 years or so. The path I took, I think, is maybe anomalous, but also there is no one clear path to being a science journalist. Many of my peers took a similar path, maybe did PhDs first before getting into science journalism. Other peers went the journalism route first with no science background, and then ended up covering biopharmaceutical sciences. Both are great paths to becoming a science journalist. I'm sure there are many others as well.
Wow, okay. First of all, it seems like you had a pretty supportive team at Nature that kind of helped you, I guess, diverge the path off from being a copy editor. I mean, what is a copy editor? What
So as a copy editor, this was working on especially review articles that were submitted to Nature Reviews Molecular Cell Biology. And this is, editing them for grammar, house style, more than content, right? So making sure that everything is fits the style of the Nature Review journals. And it requires an eye for detail, and you're exposed to a lot of science, but you're not really reading it for the science. It's basic comprehension and grammar at that stage. I certainly did have a very supportive team. The review journals have research highlights, right? So that was the first step, was writing their 300-word nibs about research papers that everyone on the team would write them. And I think not all copy editors were interested in writing them, but I was, and my team supported that. And so I started by writing those. But there were other opportunities by virtue of being at Nature that came up, to write for other ancillary magazines to Nature. I did a short stint on the Nature News desk as an intern there, again, thanks to a supportive team, both on my team and the Nature News team. I actually then left Nature for a little while to work for another publication that was fully focused on journalism. And then I came back to Nature to another very supportive team. There was two questions in there. I mean, have I answered both of those?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like the whole process was almost kind of like a mini training to kind of build up the skills to be able to go in fully fledged writing. Like you didn't jump straight in, you kind of, yeah.
Totally. I mean, it does. Science journalism, as all kinds of journalism, does require an eye for detail and an understanding of grammar and house style. And so this is this idea that, publications will sometimes use terms and words that you aren't going to be familiar with until you've kind of read the style guide, and every publication has their own style guide. Not all journalists need to know those style guide, but it makes your job easier to sort of understand the format and the language your audience wants and expects and is used to. By no means do you need to go the copy editor route? I mean, that is just the route that I took to get a foot in the door. I have other peers who, went straight into more of a writing role or an editorial role, peers who have done the whole thing as freelance, right? Like I was at Nature for a long time, but many who were freelance the whole time, all roads are equally viable.
And how does that work? Is it quite common to be a freelance journalist, or is it kind of split half and half between working for a particular company or working for yourself? It sounds quite challenging, especially working as a freelance, I guess.
I can't give you a split. I don't know what the industry split is. I mean, I can say both paths exist, right? And there's benefits to both. I think that there's a lot of people who maybe, I was going to say there's a lot of people who start working for a company and then go freelance. And I think that is something that certainly happens, but there's plenty of people who go the other way around and who flip back and forth. And, there's elements of that are great because it affords you lots of flexibility that you maybe wouldn't have otherwise. But it's also circumstantial, right? So we moved back to Canada and there are no Nature offices in Canada. And so if I wanted to continue that relationship with Nature, then I needed to do it on a freelance basis. And that has worked out great. But if I was still in London, then maybe I'd have taken a different path. Going freelance, I think for people in academia, there's people are good at leveling up, right? Academically leveling up and seeing a career progression. And when you go freelance, that career progression path disappears somewhat, right? You make your own career. And so there are pros and cons to that, that I enjoy, and that a lot of freelance science journalists are in the same boat. But as I said, it is a diverse group. We're a diverse group and doing diverse things. So I can't speak to how everyone thinks about it. But that's, yeah.
And how do you go about getting opportunities for articles and things like that as a freelance journalist? Does networking, for example, play quite a substantial role, as in knowing people and they reach out to you for a particular story, or is it a bit of a mix of both, where you have you find something, you write something, and then you approach someone and you say, hey, I've written this, are you interested?
So it's definitely a bit of both, and it changes throughout your career. Early on in your career, it's more of a pitching process, right? So I'm coming up with ideas and sometimes cold emailing editors and asking if they're interested in this idea. And it can be a brutal process with a lot of rejection. And that's part of the process. And ideally, you get to a situation in which you have, a good network of editors, and the pitching process becomes easier, but also they will approach you with story ideas as well and say, would you like to write this? I also have, a very close and good relationship with some editors who I talk regularly with and bounce ideas around. And so there's constant flow of topics that it's a matter of choosing when we're going to cover them so much as if we're going to cover them. But again, that's career dependent and job dependent. And I'm sure every freelancer does it, every journalist does it somewhat differently. If you're starting out, you've got to pitch, right? You've got to write and you've got to pitch, and you come up with ideas and you find editors who may or may not be interested in them. And it is grueling, but it is part of the process.
And I guess that's a good segue into, especially at the start of your career, was there ever a moment where you almost doubted your ability and doubted something that made you question your decision into becoming a science journalist, and especially a freelancer? Was there a moment that you ever just questioned if this was the right thing to do? Well, moment. Sometimes there's more than one usually.
I mean, not so much. I would say no. There was certainly a lot of nerves, early on, especially a lot more nerves around when I was doing a big interview about, how the interview would go. To some degree, there's still always constant questioning of, whether if I'm doing this properly, whether I've taken the right path. But it's something that comes and goes, and I suspect that is true of many careers. I think, yeah, I'd say it's a matter of sort of diving in and overcoming those fears, doing your homework and preparing as best you can and persevering. And it gets easier over time. So I write lots of articles of different lengths and different formats. And so there is some degree of, difference for the different article format type. But largely, yes, I will be choosing a topic with an editor or assigned a topic with an editor, and I will read a lot of basic research and other news and whatnot, and I will interview multiple people for a story, and then I will re-listen to those interview tapes and write a news story or news feature. I work all exclusively in print. There are many science journalists who do audio and video. It's not something I've ever done really, but that's, yeah. And then depending on who the article is for and what's been assigned, I'll write it anything from 300 words to 4,000 words on a topic.
Wow. And it seems like you have to be quite adept at picking out, especially if you have hours of interviews or, even 30 minutes of a conversation with someone, trying to pick out something relevant to your article, and that kind of gives a good point. That sounds quite challenging.
It can feel quite unfair because I will speak to someone for 30 minutes and have to sometimes reduce the quote that I use to a single soundbite. And, the interview they've given me has still been fantastic and useful and informs my background thinking about the structure and organization of the article and the science there. And it's, good for fact checking, but it is a single quote. And, we're also looking for colorful quotes as opposed to sort of quotes are not a great way of explaining science, right? And so it does sometimes feel unfair, and I try my best to represent people fairly when I single out the one quote we're going to use. But yeah, it can be a challenge.
And it seems like it can, probably depending on the size of the article you have to write, or maybe independently of that, it seems like you can spend quite a long time interviewing and researching before you actually write your finished product. What is the creative process for your work? What's the general timeline for kind of start to finish?
Is different for every article type. And I've tried different processes over the years and still use different processes for different articles. But I would say the brief answer is the deeper I immerse myself into the subject, the less I need to think about structure, right? It just kind of percolates up when I'm not thinking about it, and I can just start writing. And sometimes I will write an article from the introduction to the conclusion without having sketched out much of a outline, and sometimes I will sketch out an outline, and sometimes I will start writing in the middle and finish writing the beginning, and it changes from article to article. And maybe I should be more systematic in my approach, but it seems to work for me.
Indeed, and I think the culmination of everything we've talked about so far, it doesn't, I was going to ask, does a typical day exist for you? Possibly not, I don't know.
A typical day exists in so much as I will spend a fair amount of the day reading science and science news, and a fair amount of the day writing and editing news. But the specifics around when and how I will structure that change from day to day, and a lot of flexibility, especially for interviewing. You need to be flexible to speak with different people, and fit things around deadlines. And that's the other moving factor, right, that changes how we work. So the basics are the same, but the organization, for me anyway, differs from day to day.
And do you work on multiple articles in kind of simultaneously, or are you working on one baby at one time?
Yeah, often I will be working on multiple things at a time. It's possible to be working on too many things at a time. But again, timelines vary, right? From same day turnaround to months of working on an article. So it's nice to have that variation, and necessary to have that variation. And when things are going well, it's kind of a nice pipeline of articles in the process. And sometimes it bunches up a bit, and sometimes it feels a little sparse, and that's part of the process as well.
I guess that's a nice segue into, I was going to start off asking you what you love most about your work, but I think I'll start out by asking what's the most challenging part of your work, and we can kind of round it off with what you love the most on a high note.
Yeah, I mean, on the challenging part, it's when that pipeline is sparse, and trying to find what the next article that I want to work on is going to be, right? It can feel like a non-productive time, right? Where you're reading a lot and following a lot of leads, and nothing is clicking in the way you want to focus your time on, and that can be a challenging part of the job. What I love most about the job is following the science, right? I get to be engaged and read the science, and when I have questions, I get to pick up a phone and call the scientists and ask about it, and that's very rewarding, and I get to keep learning, and that's probably my favorite part of the job.
That's fantastic. It sounds like you're very passionate about what you do, and kind of being up and close, I guess, to the kind of cutting edge of science almost fuels you, especially in those times where you have the timeline bunching up a little bit and you have quite a lot going
on. Certainly, it is a perk of the job for sure, just getting to follow your curiosity, right? I know the scientists are always doing that, and I get to also just read cool papers and be curious about them, and I really enjoy that.
What are the opportunities available for someone in science journalism?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of opportunities, right? It is somewhat of a build your own adventure career, right? Whatever you want to pursue, you can pursue, whether it is text or video or audio or other formats, or a mix of all those formats. I mean, there's an appetite for all of it. And there is, especially after COVID, I mean, there's more of an appetite, I think, now for science journalism than there has ever been before. What you do with that and where you take that is up to you, right? In terms of career progression opportunities, some people will stay science journalists forever and keep following cool stories and writing about them. Some people will eventually move more to the communication side and work with companies or universities about sort of getting their research out and their story out. Some people will move more into the editorial side with editing. I have spoken with executives of biotech companies who started as journalists. I don't think there's many of them, but there are some out there. So there are, whatever path you want to take, you can take. And there are opportunities, but again, it is, and this may again be true of other career paths, but it is what you make of it and what you want to pursue that is up to you.
And you touched a little bit now, mentioning, especially with COVID, how it's changed the appetite, at least for science journalism. Do you have any idea on how you see the future of science journalism evolving and kind of going forward?
I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did. again, there is an appetite. There's a crazy appetite for science journalism. There is also a lot of noise, right? And a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And it can be hard as a science journalist to know how to position yourself in that and how to navigate that and how to what your role is in sort of diffusing that misinformation and disinformation. But I don't really know where the industry is going, other than I think that there will remain an appetite for people who can write in depth with good context and good understanding about science for various different audiences, right? I mean, I think that is a key element of science journalism, is that we write for lots of different people, and there's different audiences who want different things out of a story. And that's another opportunity to choose, which audience you want to write for, again, with pros and cons, to every choice.
And kind of leading on to the final few questions, what skills do you believe are necessary to be successful in science journalism? And do you have any advice on how someone can cultivate these skills?
Certainly curiosity, eye for detail, interest in science, and love of language, I suppose, are the skill sets that are required. Cultivating those, read a lot, both science, but also, science journalists that you admire and aspire to be like, and fiction and nonfiction and everything, right? Just read everything, and write. You have to start writing at some point and sort of learning those tools of the trade as well. So again, this is something that I was interested in from my undergrad and focused on in undergrad, but find venues to write. And yeah, I think those are the keys.
Cool. And I think that answers my next question. What advice do you have for someone? I think they're both kind of interrelated. But do you have any other advice regarding just entering the world of science journalism rather than cultivating the skills?
I would say a double-sided advice, which is, on the one hand, think both short-term goals and long-term goals, right? Those short-term goals can come around faster than you expected, and so it's good to have sort of longer-term ambitions in line, but also to be prepared with the unexpected that the world is going to throw at you, and adapt accordingly, which is true of any career path, I think.
Yeah. And final question, is there anything that you would have liked to have told your younger self?
I mean, I think I just answered that question. I don't have anything else to add on there. I mean, maybe buy Bitcoin at $1 and
yeah, I think that is for all of us.
$70,000. I think I'd have done that one if I could have, but nothing science journalism specific.
Cool. Yeah, everything's just keep doing what you're doing. It'll work out in the end.
Pretty much.
And that's all for this interview. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you found today's session insightful and valuable. If you'd like to hear more interviews like this, then please check out the Antibody Society's website or YouTube channel. Now, membership is free for all students and postdocs, and we have some really great value for money memberships for our industry and academic partners. Please feel free to share this video and come check us out on our LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube pages. If you'd like to connect with today's speaker or reach out to us, then please check out some of the details in the description box below. And thank you again for listening.